So yeah, so for this project, we are evaluating the impact of social exclusion on psychotic-like experiences. And what I say when I mean that, we're talking about social connection more broadly. It's very important to well-being. We all know how good it feels to be included and how bad it feels excluded. But there's also a lot of long-term data to back this up. It has a lot of effects on physical health and also mental health in the long term. And similarly, schizophrenia is this disorder that has a lot of really damaging effects on well-being and functioning in daily life. So it's really important to understand how this disorder develops. And one of the biggest theories for how it might develop is the social defeat hypothesis. And this is an idea that kind of connects these two themes of social exclusion and schizophrenia. The mechanism of this theory is that being socially excluded sensitizes your brain's dopamine response. And through this mechanism, social exclusion creates psychotic symptoms. So this is kind of based on a pre-existing theory, the dopamine hypothesis. And there's a lot of work to back this up on people with schizophrenia having a stronger dopamine response. But we also see that being socially excluded, especially in animal models, it creates this really strong effect of having a bigger dopamine response after you've been excluded. And so since social exclusion creates this bigger dopamine response, and the dopamine response leads to schizophrenia, the idea of the social defeat hypothesis is that social exclusion creates psychotic symptoms. So we wanted to test this theory because, like I just mentioned, there's a lot of kind of indirect work that targets each different step of the theory. There is a lot of correlational stuff saying that people who are excluded more often have psychotic symptoms, but there's very little experiments that actually try to do this in a controlled way instead of just a correlational way. So we wanted to test this theory by putting it into an experimental setting. We wanted to expose our participants to an instance of social exclusion, and then we wanted to measure some cognitive biases that are associated with schizophrenia and with psychotic-like experiences. So we chose these two measures. Auditory, it's a little bit cut off. Auditory perceptual errors and reduced trust are the two measures. And so both of these phenomena are really strongly linked to people with schizophrenia and psychotic-like experiences. Both of these groups show really high rates of both perceptual errors and mistrust. So really high perceptual errors, really low trust. And based on that, we also wanted to see if experiencing these things in daily life was going to affect this relationship. Like, for example, if you have more hallucinations in your day-to-day life, is that going to make you have more perceptual errors in the lab? And if you have more paranoid thoughts on a day-to-day basis, is that going to result in lower trust? So we figured that experiencing these things in day-to-day life might have an effect. So we measured them as moderators to see if that was going to be the case. And we expected to see excluded participants reporting more perceptual errors and lower trust than the participants who had been included. So again, we did that by first excluding participants to an instance of inclusion or exclusion. After that, we measured their perceptual errors and trust. And then finally, we measured these moderators of the daily levels of these things. So the first, yay, it's playing. Okay, so this is how we created instances of exclusion. This is Cyberball. And so it's a digital game where participants enter and you're supposed to be playing with these other two players. They're actually computerized, but you get told that they're other real people who are participating in the study. And then the computer randomly assigns you to an exclusion condition, which is where they stop throwing to you after a few tosses, and they just toss it back and forth to each other, and you're kind of standing there and they ignore you. Or you're assigned to an inclusion condition, and in this one, everything kind of goes as normal and they keep tossing to you. So these are the two different conditions, and this screen recording is actually the exclusion condition. So that was the participant's last toss. And so they're just going to keep tossing back and forth to each other. This is a pretty well-validated measure for creating exclusion. And so we thought, since it's been used in so much other work, it would be a great thing to use here. And to see if our manipulation was effective, we used this scale as our manipulation check. This is the needs threat scale, and it has a bunch of these questions where you rate your agreement on different statements, like, I felt I was able to throw the ball as often as I wanted, or I felt good about myself. So higher scores on this scale indicate that you feel more included, and we expected included people to have higher scores than excluded people. And this question at the top, have you ever played cyberball before today? We included this so that we could remove participants from the data set who already knew about cyberball, because if you've learned about it before, pretty much its only purpose is to make people feel excluded. And we thought if people already know about that, we should remove them. So that's why that is there. This was our first measure of perceptual errors, the auditory signal detection task. And so with this task, you have some clips of white noise. Let's see if it'll. So it sounds like that. And then some of these clips are only the white noise, and some of them have a human voice embedded in them. It's pretty much just a regular speech track. Yeah, just kind of the middle of the sentence. And so they're at different audio levels, and the participant listens to a bunch of these clips, and then after each clip, they press 1 if they hear a voice, and 2 if they think it's only white noise with no voice. And the measure that we're interested in getting here is when participants press 1, but there's not actually a voice there. So hearing something when there's not actually a stimulus there, and again, this is really strongly correlated. There's really high false alarm rates in both people with schizophrenia and people who regularly experience psychotic-like experiences. So similarly, our other measure is the trust task. And this one, again, is really strongly correlated. It's highly found in people with both schizophrenia and people with psychotic-like experiences. This one is pretty simple. There's just a bunch of faces, and then you rate from 1 to 7 on how trustworthy you think that the person looks. Really high scores mean that you have high rates of trust, and then low scores mean that you're not trusting, you have low scores of trust. And so some moderators, we wanted to see if in daily life, people who experience more hallucinations, we're going to have more perceptual errors. So we use this scale. It's a bunch of yes or no questions on different hallucinatory experiences. Do you hear voices commenting on what you're doing? Do you see shapes, lights, or colors? So all of these things, you agree yes or no. And the more yeses, the more hallucinations you have in your daily life. And we wanted to see if that would affect false alarm rate. And then this is the revised green paranoid thought scale. And this measures your daily paranoid thoughts. You rate from 1 to 4 on how often these things happen. More higher scores means that you have more paranoid thoughts in your day-to-day life, and less means that you have less. And so this has 2 subscales. They refer to referential thoughts and persecutory thoughts. These are just the 2 different types of paranoid thoughts, but they're part of the same scale. And finally, for our data analysis, for our main outcomes, which was again, the perceptual errors and the trust, we conducted some 2 sample t-tests to figure out our moderators, which again was our daily experiences. We performed a linear regression with an interaction term for whatever the specific moderator was. We also had to remove some people from the data set. As I mentioned before, if participants knew about cyberball already, then it wouldn't necessarily work. So we removed them. If they guessed our study hypothesis correctly, we had a question at the end where they could type in what they thought the study was about. And we also had some attention checks in there. So anybody who failed any of these, we removed, and that ended up being about 30 participants. The findings didn't really change after that, but we still thought it was important to do. We also got some outliers, so we Winsorized them to make the data more accurate. And again, that didn't change the findings either. So getting into the results, we ended up with about 96 participants in our data set. Pre-removal, that was 126, but after we removed those 30, it was 96. And so based on a power analysis that we did, which was based on another study that had a similar design to ours, we conducted that and we got a target of 100 participants. So 96 was pretty close to the target. And actually, we're still recruiting right now. I'm kind of in the middle of it as I'm presenting this. So we're still recruiting people now, and it's going to end up being higher than that. We asked them to report history of mental disorder, and none of them did. We recruited only people without history of psychiatric disorder because we wanted to make sure that any results we saw were not the results of any disorders they might have. we wanted to make sure that all the results we saw were a result of the exclusion. So we had no history of mental disorder. Our sample skewed pretty young. We tried to recruit just anyone in the community, but we had really high response rate from college students. So it was 99% college students. And pretty interestingly, we had predominantly women. The two biggest racial groups were people who identified as Asian and white. And conducting some analyses across these groups, we didn't find any differences in the demographics on the other measures. So where we're at, we have just social exclusion lead to psychotic-like experiences. And what we were thinking is that excluded participants will have more perceptual errors and lower trust of strangers. And let's see. So cyberball was very effective. We had a pretty big effect size and it was very significant. So these plots here are called violin plots, and they're really cool because you can see the distribution in a lot of detail here. So you can see a lot of really specific information about how people reported. And there's, again, a really big difference between these groups. We also compared our effect size to a meta-analysis that did a bunch of cyberball studies, and our effect was pretty similar. So we figured that our manipulation was very effective because it's on par with some other studies that have used it. However, that did not result in a difference in perceptual errors. As you can see here, the distribution is very similar. Also, our effect size was quite small and it was not significant. So we really did not see a difference in perceptual errors. Also, daily experiences with hallucinations did not moderate this. We had, again, a small effect size and it was not significant. So the amount of hallucinations people experienced in their daily lives did not have an effect on this relationship. Similarly with trust, also no difference. So we have pretty similar distribution here again, and pretty small to medium effect size, not significant, so no real difference there. And again, here, our moderator was also insignificant. So the amount of paranoid thoughts that people had in their daily lives did not impact this relationship significantly. So where does that leave us? Social exclusion did not really have a significant effect on either of these measures. And people's daily experiences with these things in daily life also did not have an effect. So this is pretty unusual considering that all this other literature until now has supported this theory, but there are a couple different things that it can mean. So one thing is that since most of the literature up till now has been correlational, it's possible that it takes a lot of instances of exclusion because we only did one. So it might take a lot of instances of exclusion, and we don't really know how many, so it could be a lot. There's also other vulnerabilities that could play a role. There are a lot of theories called diathesis stress models, and these models basically state that you need to have both a vulnerability, and that can be like genetic or familial, and then that vulnerability is going to interact with a social factor, such as social exclusion like this, or other social factors. So there's a pretty strong possibility that you also need to have a pre-existing vulnerability to see this effect, but you might not necessarily see it if you don't have the vulnerability. A couple limitations. There is a possibility of having a respondent bias because we did mostly get college students, so we don't necessarily know. There could be something about being a college student. Maybe if you're participating for credit, like you don't care as much. There's also the fact that we had people self-report their mental illness instead of, administering a questionnaire or something. We just asked them yes or no. So there could be a disorder that someone has that they don't know about that could affect the results. There was also a lot of reports of people when I came into the room after testing and I asked them if they thought that the players were real. A good amount of them said, no, I didn't think they were real. And we don't really expect this to impact the relationship because when cyberball was first being created, one of the situations that it was tested in was the regular one where you tell people that the players are real. But the other version that they tested it in was convincing the participants that it was a computer. So the players just completely knew that it was a computer the whole time, and they still showed a really big effect of exclusion. So we don't really think that this is going to have an effect. For future directions, there's a lot of opportunities for follow-up studies here, especially ones with a prospective design, because if we use a perspective model, we can see how many instances of exclusion it takes. If we measure people at baseline, and then one format that we could use is a daily diary, so people could report every day how excluded they felt. And then based on that data, it could give us a lot of information about how many instances of exclusion it might take for us to see an effect. There are also some interacting factors that can be investigated, not only genetic or familiar, as I mentioned before, but there are also some personality or social ones. For example, coping strategies, like after you're excluded, how good are you at coping with that? You know, does it bother you very much? Or are you able to just kind of feel like, okay, move on? So that's one. Another one is distress at being excluded. So if you're really bothered by being excluded, is that different from someone who being excluded doesn't really matter to them? So these interacting factors and even other possible ones would be a great thing to investigate and follow up. So I'd like to thank not only all the members of the Social Cognition Psychopathology Lab, but specifically David Dodell-Fetter and Bridget Schoenstol, my mentors. They helped me a lot with this. And then Gloria Liu, she helped a lot with the testing. So all of them played a huge role in this study. So thank you very much.